All right, Dom D'Agostino, we are recording. So thanks so much for taking the time to reconnect today.
Great to reconnect and see you again, Jake, for sure.
And, and for those who don't know, Dom D'Agostino is a researcher and professor with a diverse background in neuroscience, molecular pharmacology, nutrition, and physiology. Dom, you are a tenured associate professor in the Department of Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology at the University of South Florida. And you're a research scientist at the Institute for Human and Machine Cognition. What did I miss there?
Yeah, I think that's about it. And I am a co-host for the Metabolic Health Summit, and also it's part of that is the Metabolic Initiative platform, which is a platform that generates continuing medical education credits for people who want to be trained and get educated on the topics that we're going to talk about, and also have the Metabolic Link podcast too. Got to throw that in.
Amazing. Metabolic Link podcast, and you're building a medical education platform, and I will definitely ask you about both of those in a bit. But first, I want to ask you about the ketogenic diet. So you are one of, if not the leading authority on the ketogenic diet, and I've seen that there's debate sometimes around the long-term viability or ability for someone to do this diet, and that there's purported risks of it. I mean, what's your stance on this? Do you see it being hard to maintain? How do you address concerns like regarding? I think people have said things like it might cause nutrient deficiencies. Do you see that as legitimate, or are there any real risks to the keto diet?
Yeah, of course, it's really context dependent, and I know you've talked with Jim Abrams before, and in his case, Charlie, I mean, it was a life or death situation with implementing this and sustaining it at least for a year or two, and he was able to transition off of the diet and be seizure free, so it like cured his epilepsy. So the sustainability, I think, really comes down to the motivation behind the person implementing the ketogenic diet, why they are doing it, their existing diet, what kind of, actually, probably one of the biggest factors after communicating with hundreds, if not thousands of people, is the support system that they're in. For example, if someone's following the ketogenic diet, but the entire household is on like a processed food, high carbohydrate diet, that usually is a recipe for disaster. So I think the person needs to be internally motivated to do the diet, and also subjectively and objectively, with objective biomarkers, have a good response to the diet. And I think that's the most important thing, that they're internally motivated because of some health reason, whether it's type 2 diabetes, epilepsy, just simply weight loss, which is probably the majority of people. That's probably the most important thing. But that support system is also really important for sustainability. It is sustainable. I'll quickly add that, I'm just coming from a number of different conferences on like rare metabolic diseases where people have been on the diet continuously, a very strict form of the diet for 20, 30 years or more, continuous, where they never have a day where they're not. And so we know from that perspective, we know it's sustainable. And actually their blood work looks fantastic. So it doesn't seem to be causing an atherogenic risk. And that comes up probably more often than not. The discussion, at least, or the debate. Yeah.
Got it. And sorry that I'm gonna have to start with all these hard questions. That makes a lot of sense. The other criticism I've heard is the impact on athletic performance for high intensity sports that rely on glycogen stores. So what do you think about that? Is that a legitimate concern?
Yeah. Actually, you bring up probably another of the most talked about, at least on social media, actually in the literature now too. Clinicaltrials.gov has probably about 24 or more registered clinical trials on athletic performance, which is really interesting. I never thought I do work a little bit in that realm, and didn't think studying the ketogenic diet would take me down that realm. I'll say that ketosis maximizes your body's ability to use fat as an energy source from the context of a working muscle. So with that said, the optimal approach would really be optimizing your diet through nutrition and also training to optimize fat utilization. So that would involve some form of carbohydrate restriction. and ketogenic is probably optimizes fat oxidation the most, but you want to do it in a way that does not compromise glycolytic metabolism or or glucose metabolism or carbohydrate metabolism. So I think, an ideal approach would be to lower carbohydrate to a certain threshold where you're burning fat. And there's different ways to measure that with like a metabolic cart, with blood ketones, with different blood work, biomarkers, even looking at lactate, during your training. So you could do that. And in that way, and a lot of athletes do that anyway. A lot of athletes that even are on a high carb diet will when they train, they go into ketosis. It's called post-exercise ketosis. So they're almost keto adapted without even following a ketogenic diet. And so they can usually transition okay to low carb. But if they transition to a full-blown ketogenic diet, that could impair performance for 3 months or more, and it could take upwards of 6 months to even a year to get back to that super high, and we're talking about the elite level athletes that do like ultra marathon, like the top 1%. So that's important. But when in studying elite athletes, what we found, and we published a couple of reports recently, is that if we look at continuous glucose monitor data, which is the devices that people wear, that diabetics wear to measure glucose control during a 24-hour period, or they wear them for a couple of weeks and then replace them. The CGM data is most favorable in athletes that are on a low carb diet versus a high carb diet. And this is important from the perspective of some form of carbohydrate restriction can enhance athletic performance, provide favorable logistics, meaning they don't have to take in sugary gels throughout their running because they're pulling more energy off fat, and can enhance recovery because of different metabolic and inflammatory biomarkers are optimized. And I think also from the perspective of long-term health, and Tim Noakes has written about this probably more than anybody else, just switching from a high carb fueled athletic background to a low carb fueled. And the athletes that he's in touch with just show all those things that I talked about: performance, recovery, logistics, and like fuel utilization during the event, and also long-term metabolic health, can all be improved. Whether a person has to be full-blown ketogenic diet is kind of under debate, but some form of carbohydrate restriction.
Got it. No, that's interesting, and that makes a lot of sense. So Dom, you were just talking about keto, and you mentioned that the point I had is covered a lot on social media and also in some studies. And I'm wondering, like, as with any dietary approach, there's sometimes a disconnect between what you find in the scientific literature versus the mainstream perception or like the media portrayal. What are like the biggest misconceptions or myths that you have to unfortunately encounter regarding the ketogenic diet? Beyond, are there any, like what we just discussed? Would that be kind of the biggest myth, or is there something else?
Yeah. Well, one thing that's under debate now, and I still think I'm not sure if it'll ever be sufficiently resolved, is that there are two different camps, like I guess you would call them the calories in, calorie out camp, or the energy balance, versus the carbohydrate insulin model. So there's two different theories out there on weight management, and I think they both have a lot of truth to them. And I think this applies mostly in the context of obesity, and if we can fundamentally understand what's driving the skyrocketing levels of obesity. And there's a particular theory that kind of weighs heavily in one direction, but I think it's not that simple. And I think there's truth to all the different things out there. There's obviously truth to energy balance. You need to be in an energy balance to maintain your weight, and have a decreased energy balance to lose weight. And I think the carbohydrate insulin model is interesting too, because if you eat carbohydrates, your insulin goes up, and that's the fat storage hormone. But I guess in regards to misconceptions, I'm not particularly convinced that one diet, that the ketogenic diet, is superior for long-term and sustained weight loss than any other diet. If you take into consideration, if you control for protein and you control for calories. So I think higher protein diets do have, good data to support their use for weight loss and sustained weight loss, and actually, maintaining skeletal muscle mass during weight loss, which is really important to do that. So I think that's the important thing, that the ketogenic diet's really, it doesn't provide a superior metabolic advantage. There's probably a slight advantage, but it's like maybe 100. I mean, when you're in a state of ketosis and your urine has ketones in it, and that at the end of the day, that could be 100 calories, of ketone urea. So that's a little bit of calories there, and you are wasting some calories. But then a higher protein ketogenic diet, in my mind, would be slightly favorable, because you have something called the thermic effect of food, which occurs with a higher protein diet, and the ketosis, which controls insulin, glycemic control, appetite, satiety, GLP-1. It's a natural GLP-1 way to elevate GLP-1 and get your hormones under control, more or less. So there's that there, and that's probably the most debated and talked about. The other is that a ketogenic diet will cause muscle wasting, and that you can't build muscle on a ketogenic diet. You definitely can. It's easier to maintain muscle on a ketogenic diet, but if you're like a young, healthy teenager or 20-year-old, it'd probably be favorable to add some carbohydrates in to maximize muscle strength and size. But you can absolutely sustain muscle on a ketogenic diet. I've seen it done many times. I've been able to do it as long as the ketogenic diet is higher in protein. A classical ketogenic diet like that used by Charlie Abrams is like 8% protein. That's kids grow, and they can, grow muscle on that, because you're very sensitive to anabolic hormones at a younger age when you're growing. But you can also stunt growth. Obviously, Charlie Abrams, it did not stunt his growth, because he's like 6'4", and he used it.
And Charlie Abrams, for those who don't know, this is Jim Abrams' son. Jim Abrams is the director of the 1980s movie Airplane, and he started a foundation called the Charlie Foundation for his son Charlie, who as a child had really severe epilepsy. And Jim Abrams discovered, I think with the help of Dom, right, that the ketogenic diet.
He discovered way before me. In 1994, he was on Dateline NBC, and I saw that as I was learning about diet.
And discovered that the ketogenic diet helped his son Charlie not have seizures. And that's how he formed the Charlie Foundation, which now helps children find ways to leverage the ketogenic diet for therapy. So sorry, just a quick background there.
No, that's important too. And for people like even more interested in this whole story, there's a docudrama, I guess I would call it, because Meryl Streep was the actor in it, called First Do No Harm. And that's really a documentary / drama with actors portraying Charlie, Meryl Streep, portraying Charlie's mom, which kind of documents that story about implementing a ketogenic diet to essentially save the life of Charlie Abrams. So that was very inspiring to me. And I think watching that changed the direction of my research from drug-based research for seizures to diet-based research for seizures. And then ultimately developing synthetic ketogenic compounds to more or less get ketogenic diets into a drug. We're still working on that. And there's, they can be used optimally probably to enhance the ketogenic diet. So, high protein ketogenic diets, you can build muscle, sustain muscle. And also, I guess the third thing would be saturated fat being highly atherogenic and will give you a heart attack. I think I just interviewed Dr. Nina Teicholz. She recently got her PhD on the subject, friends with Gary Taubes too. And she's written about this exhaustively, that saturated fat should not be demonized. It's very context dependent. So saturated fat in the form of, fast food and the background of a high carbohydrate diet can certainly be atherogenic, especially with surplus calories. But saturated fat in and of itself is not inherently dangerous in regards to like colon cancer or atherogenic risk, or even LDL cholesterol, which is another topic of debate. So that's like the three things that I see, not only in the literature, but being debated online quite a bit.
Interesting. And Dom, not only are you a researcher and furthering the science and data on ketogenic diet, you're also an educator, and you are a primary reason that so many people, myself included, first learned about the ketogenic diet. One of the ways, or two of the ways, that you're spreading this information now are through your medical education platform and also through your podcast. Can you tell us more about these platforms that you've created, and how you got started, and what the mission is?
Yeah, sure. And thanks for asking. I think when we were working, more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago on ketogenic diet therapies, we realized that education outreach was really important. So we organized a symposium, which then became a conference at University of South Florida. It outgrew the host hotel there, and then we moved it to California, and that was called the Metabolic Health Summit, it's called now. And as it grew to like 800 up to about 1,000 participants, at the Metabolic Health Summit, we realized that there needs to be a medical education platform. So my co-host, Dr. Angela Poff and Victoria Field, run what's called the Metabolic Health Initiative. As a full-time research, or full-time teaching and full-time research, I don't have time to kind of run that entity, but I help them promote it. And that the Metabolic Health Initiative does two things. It really is the platform for the Metabolic Link podcast, where we have many guests talk. We have free podcasts that people can access, like on YouTube and on Spotify and whatnot. And then we go do a deeper dive into their particular expertise on the science and implementation of specific metabolic therapies. That could be diet therapies, it could be, drug-based therapies, but it's tied to metabolic health for particular disorders. That could be cancer, neurological diseases, epilepsy, and especially metabolic psychiatry, which is the use of ketogenic diet for things like bipolar, schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, even anorexia, which is actually the psychiatric disorder that kills more people than anybody else. So we're developing an educational platform where practitioners can learn about the science and the application of this. And that's a big part of what we're doing now. In addition to that, I teach in the nutrition program at University of South Florida and get to mentor medical students on a wide variety of different research and literature projects related to nutrition. So I'm trying to sort of proselytize the the early medical students, and really ingrain in them, because otherwise they would not be taught that nutrition is probably the biggest lever you can pull if you want to manage and prevent disease from happening that you would otherwise need to be just writing prescriptions for. So instead of a sick care system, it's a true healthcare system if physicians can prioritize metabolic health and nutrition. And exercise too, because exercise is a form of, metabolic therapy.
Absolutely. So you're busy. That's a lot of stuff that you're balancing.
Yeah. It's all interrelated and tied together. So like the basic science research is tied to the clinical, is tied to the education. So on paper, it seems like a lot, but since it's all interconnected, and it's kind of my hobby too, so it doesn't really feel like much of a burden,
But teaching and researching, and then the education platforms. So let's talk a bit about the latest science on the ketogenic diet. You've been studying this now for a while, and I'm wondering, what are the biggest findings maybe of the last few years? And in particular, I'm curious about what the ketogenic diet might be able to do for the things that ail us most: cancer, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, dementia, Alzheimer's, depression. I mean, where do you think the most exciting or promising benefit of the ketogenic diet lies as it pertains to disease?
Yeah. Well, I guess the last time we talked, if I was to go to clinicaltrials.gov, which is where the clinical trials are registered, and people can access that platform, clinicaltrials.gov, and search. And if they search ketogenic diet in the search term, they'll get about 500 clinical trials on the ketogenic diet. And last time we spoke, Jake, there may have been 10 or 20, maybe 30.
Wow. Wow.
So we're talking about, an exponential growth of ketogenic diet research. And that includes, if I bring up the thing here, we got for epilepsy and seizure disorders, like 60 or 70 trials, Alzheimer's disease, about a dozen trials, Parkinson's, 4 or 5, cancer and muscle wasting. We have about 30 or 40 trials. Weight loss, of course, is quite a bit, like 25. But then you have things like type 2 diabetes, type 1 diabetes, migraine, a whole host of metabolic disorders like Angelman syndrome, glucose transporter, whole Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. There's like them, and they have been used. The ketogenic diet has been the standard of care for like Lennox-Gastaut, glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome, different rare metabolic disorders. But then you have, if you look down the line, and I'm just looking at the trials now, like traumatic brain injury, there's psychiatric disorders, bipolar, anxiety, autism. There's quite a few autism studies with that. There's, lymphedema, there's stroke, there's obstructive sleep apnea. There's a number of different, emerging applications of a ketogenic diet that I would otherwise, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, alcohol withdrawal syndrome, benzodiazepine withdrawal syndrome. Like we have a huge problem in, it's, I don't know, there's multiple factors. Some people say COVID, the lockdown, things like that. But drug use and addiction and dependence is a big problem. And I was on a PhD dissertation where I saw the research suggesting that ketogenic diet therapies can be profoundly effective, and they could be used as a standalone, but also help, in combination with other drugs to get people off of highly addictive drugs, especially opioid drugs, benzodiazepine drugs, and alcohol. So I think that, if someone asked me like, what surprises you the most on, the latest science of the ketogenic diet, is the sheer number of clinical trials. And the ketogenic diet is the only diet that's scientifically validated by an objective biomarker. So that's urine, breath, or blood ketone levels. A vegan diet, Mediterranean diet, these are all very fuzzy terms. A ketogenic diet is a very specific macronutrient ratio that produces a profoundly altered metabolic change in our metabolic physiology that promotes high fat oxidation, low insulin, low glucose. And I think that makes it, from my perspective, a very unique thing, especially from the context of brain energy metabolism. So and that's our lab really spends a lot of time, effort, and funding to figure out mechanistically how the ketogenic diet changes our brain. And I think that's like the next frontier with brain imaging, metabolomics, looking at, different markers that are impacted by ketone metabolism, and exogenous ketones, which is, our lab is heavily invested in the science and application of dozens of different molecules that can, when administered orally or IV, can mimic this therapeutic physiological state and have, a lot of different applications.
Wow. That's incredible how many additional studies there have been and how much the library of research has grown. Could you share one or two of the most compelling findings or case studies?
Yeah, well, there's a whole bunch of them. I
Yeah,
think,
sure.
actually, I will bring up a case study that I was an author on that it's an interesting story. And we were connected at the time in 2016. Russell Winwood reached out to me, and he had a disorder called chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And I did my PhD at University of Medicine Dentistry, Rutgers, in a pulmonary critical care division. And I knew enough to know that COPD was a death sentence. And he connected in 2016 and said, hey, I had this condition. It's a death sentence, and I'm just hoping to get a couple years, extend my life. Do you think a ketogenic diet would help? And I was like, Russell, I don't know, but I don't see harm in implementing a ketogenic diet. So he used a ketogenic diet. And then I think in 2017 or 18, he added ketone supplementation to that diet, and he profoundly increased his functional expiratory volume, or FEV1. And so he dramatically lowered his inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein, I believe IL-1 beta, maybe TNF alpha, like basically biomarkers that are indicative of having chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. This causes fibrosis in the lungs. And so he dramatically improved on paper, and he stayed in a state of sustained ketosis by eating a ketogenic diet, using MCT oil and ketone supplementation, and dramatically improved his functional capacity in his lungs. And he was sending me the data, and he was like, I think we should write this into a case report. So the person who literally wrote the book on COPD that medical students use is Peter Barnes. And, he's got like a Wikipedia page. He's an esteemed professor in the UK. So we reached out to Peter Barnes and showed him the case. And then he actually became the senior author of a case report, which is entitled, the use of a ketogenic diet to, treat chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. And so this is a really good example of an emerging application that no one would have thought of, that completely reversed a terminal disorder where you had an increase in functional capacity that, to my knowledge, no one has ever seen before. And Russell was highly motivated. He goes under he's COPD athlete, I think, on Instagram and social platforms. COPD athlete, like if you look him up, he runs marathons with COPD, and I'm not sure we'd have him here today if he did not go ketogenic. So I think it's a very sobering and real demonstration of the power of a metabolic therapy, specifically ketone. We like to call it ketone metabolic therapy, because that sort of encompasses, you can achieve therapeutic ketosis with time-restricted feeding, which I'm a big fan of. You could achieve it through a ketogenic diet, and there's different versions of that. You could achieve it or greatly augment it with ketogenic supplements, and they're still being studied. So we just kind of put it under the umbrella of ketone metabolic therapy, and I'm very excited to see this being applied to other disorders, especially like psychiatric disorders like bipolar and schizophrenia, because anti-epileptic drugs are used to manage those types of disorders, and they can do so in more or less in ineffective ways for some people. So you have a therapy that we know works through kind of overlapping mechanism. With these drugs, it's multiple mechanisms and synergy. So another case report was a woman that had anorexia, where they used ketamine. They used a ketogenic diet combined with ketamine to treat severe anorexia. And I mentioned anorexia kills more people. It's a psychiatric disease that kills more people than any other psychiatric disease. And then it produced remission. And this is very not very, and I've been in contact with, the family that, was part of this trial, more or less. And the patient is in sustained remission, as long as they can maintain and sustain a ketogenic diet as therapy. So I think, it's really inspiring to see people more or less spearheading this area of research. And it's areas of research that I never would have thought would be possible, with ketogenic diet therapies. But diet especially ketogenic diets, have a profound effect on your physiology. And when you change your physiology, you profoundly change not only your brain energy metabolism, but you change the neuropharmacology of your brain, and that your brain works differently. You think differently. You have a different outlook. It impacts and attenuates greatly things like anxiety or just changes in mood and fluctuations in mood. It's a very powerful stabilizing effect on the brain, and that's why it works for seizures. So, I think there's just so many different exciting potential applications out there that we haven't even discovered yet.
Wow. So the ones affecting mood and anxiety, what mechanisms do you believe underlie those effects, and what implications might that have for like mental health and cognitive performance?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked, because that's like the thing that we study most in our lab.
Wow.
Uh, it's a lot of research that we have done went into the adenosine A1 receptor, and that kind of gets that it's an interesting story there. But I think uh, from just a high level perspective is that certain diseases like depression, for example, are associated with glucose hypometabolism or in obesity related depression. So a ketogenic diet is providing an alternative energy substrate that could kind of wake up neurons that are otherwise hypoactive. So you could stimulate certain areas. You have to be careful though with bipolar, because the stimulating effect of ketones can actually induce a further manic state. So the diets need to be titrated and adjusted to the patient. So that's important for people who maybe have bipolar or other psychiatric diseases to work very, very closely with a dietitian and a practitioner to implement this. But I think the three things, and there's about a dozen, but the three things would be changing brain energy metabolism. So we know that. And then what we have like focused on too is changing a neurotransmitter called GABA, and that's gamma aminobutyric acid. So GABA is a very calming neurotransmitter, and it tends to work sort of opposite of glutamate, which can cause hyper excitability, anxiety, and even pathophysiologically linked to different neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, excess glutamate. So it's neurotoxic. So ketone therapies, that could be the diet and ketone supplements, elevate GABA 2 or 3-fold in animal models, and human studies too supports this. So you have a greater conversion of glutamate to GABA. So that's actually how we make GABA, is with the neurotransmitter glutamate through an enzyme called glutamic acid decarboxylase. So ketogenic, for reasons we don't completely understand, being in a state of ketosis activates the enzyme that transitions a neurotransmitter that makes us anxious and excitable to calming and more stable. So you make more GABA from glutamate. So that's like firmly established in the literature. And then the third thing that I think is important is the anti-inflammatory effects. Many psychiatric disorders are pathophysiologically linked to inflammation in the body and the brain. And if you have inflammation in your body, you can measure that with something like C-reactive protein. HSCRP is a sensitive indicator of that. Inflammation in the body will typically trigger inflammation in the brain, and that can also be coming from the gut. We have tight junctions in the gut. When the gut becomes, intestinal permeability is compromised, those same tight junctions are in like the blood-brain barrier, and then circulating inflammatory cytokines can cross over and cause the brain to be inflamed. And when the brain is inflamed, that typically triggers anxiety, depression, dramatic changes in mood. This could happen with like a flare up of shingles. It could happen with COVID. It could happen with Lyme's disease. It could happen. So there are infectious agents too that I think that we could have. And that's another story, right? There's different, like Epstein-Barr virus, cytomegalovirus, herpes simplex, there's various viruses that flare up now and then, and these things can alter mood. But I think, and I bring that up because ketone metabolic therapies have been very effective. There have been a number of people, many of that some are celebrities that I'm not going to mention, but that had flare-ups, and they reached out to me because they wanted me to know that, whether it be intermittent fasting or the ketogenic diet or ketone supplementation was a very powerful lever that they could pull to decrease those infection-induced, inflammation. And I think, that's another emerging area of science. There's a chair of Harvard, I forget, in his department, he studies different viral illnesses and bacterial illnesses as the etiological agent that's causing Alzheimer's disease. So this was like very fringe the last time we connected, but now a body of literature exists that various I guess we knew this with syphilis and everything, because when you have Alzheimer's disease, you get tested for things like that. But there's a whole host of infectious agents that are likely contributing to neurological diseases and psychiatric diseases. So, and in those cases, ketogenic therapy seemed to be helpful, but obviously you need to also target directly with antivirals or antibiotics, directly the infectious agent. So, and that they cause psychological changes in the brain through neuroinflammation. And the reason I bring it up is because that was a third kind of thing that I think mechanism that ketogenic therapies are working through, significantly reducing systemic inflammation and neuroinflammation.
Oh, wow. And beyond just even the diet itself, I think you have studied interventions that supplement the diet, like exogenous ketones and also hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So how do those modalities complement or even like enhance the effects of ketogenic diets?
Yeah, well, I originally got into ketogenic therapies as an anti-seizure effect because of oxygen toxicity associated with hyperbaric oxygen that's too high, from the context of military applications like Navy SEALs using rebreathers. But oxygen toxicity is also a limitation of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. We can only go up to 3 atmospheres. If we go any higher than that, we trigger a seizure in people getting it. So hyperbaric oxygen therapy stimulates brain activity. And in that context, it can be used to, for example, augment cognition in older people, maybe stimulate stem cell release and the production of stem cells. Also, if you've had a stroke or traumatic brain injury and you intervene very early, hyperbaric oxygen may be able to help, especially if the individual is younger. With that said, I mean, that's sort of research that's ongoing, but hyperbaric oxygen therapy has 14 different FDA approved applications, from carbon monoxide poisoning to decompression sickness to ischemic wounds, right? But I think it has many, the use of hyperbaric oxygen therapy for cancer is something that we've studied. When you hyperoxygenate a tumor, when you reverse tumor hypoxia, that stimulates a huge burst of oxygen-free radicals in the cells of cancer. So cancer cells will sequester iron and porphyrin, and it's kind of like this porphyrin overdrive hypothesis, where a hallmark characteristic of cancer cells is that they have high metabolism, high glucose metabolism, but they also sequester a lot of iron. So it makes them selectively vulnerable to both a ketogenic therapy that restricts glucose, their primary energy source, and also oxidative stress, which is the mechanism through which high pressure oxygen, which can increase the partial pressure of oxygen in the tumor, upwards of 10 to 20 times higher. So it's and that's how radiation therapy works. Radiation therapy kills cancer cells through reactive oxygen species. Hyperbaric oxygen therapy does it in a much more gentle way through the systems of your body, and works synergistically with a ketogenic diet that lowers glucose, lowers insulin, and these are driving growth factors. And also it reduces the availability of glucose for something called the pentose phosphate pathway. And it's like how cells generate an antioxidant called glutathione. So it's like crippling the cancer cell's defense system and metabolism while simultaneously, and this is where hyperbaric oxygen comes in, accelerates oxygen-free radicals. So this is something we are super passionate about and have been working. I would say about half of what we do is cancer and half of what we do is neurological diseases, and that's where the two, metabolic therapy and hyperbaric therapy, can be used together.
And are hospitals currently using ketogenic diet to fight cancer in patients?
For cancer, they are using it. If you go to clinicaltrials.gov, I would say only 1 or 2 trials are using it as a standalone therapy. So what hospitals and institutes are doing, they're using ketogenic diet therapy or ketone metabolic therapy with supplements too, to further augment the therapeutic effects of standard of care. So that could be chemotherapy, radiation. But the new frontier of research is indicating that, and there was a Nature Medicine paper that came out that looked at a vegan diet versus a ketogenic diet on the immune system. 2 weeks of a ketogenic diet greatly augmented the adaptive immune system. What that means is that there are certain powerful anti-cancer drugs called checkpoint inhibitors, like PD-1 inhibitors. So in theory, a ketogenic diet could greatly augment the cancer-specific targeting effects of a checkpoint inhibitor, like a PD-1 inhibitor. So a number of researchers and institutes are looking to enhance their immune therapies for cancer with ketogenic therapies. So that's something that we're kind of working on now, and I think is a really interesting new direction that investigators are putting a lot of time and effort and hopefully funding into.
Wow. And Dom, final question. If there was one piece of advice or statement that you'd want people to know who are not that familiar with the ketogenic diet, or they're skeptical about it, or they're worried if they can even do it, what would you say as encouragement for people who have not tried this before?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of misinformation out there, and I think that becomes a problem because anyone can say anything on the internet. So, what I do with people that approach me with skepticism, or they come and they sensationalize the ketogenic diet, I direct them to like PubMed, right? If you just go to PubMed and type in ketogenic diet and then search like review articles, you really want to direct, because everybody that approaches me, like, they're interested in using a ketogenic diet for something, and it could be like an autoimmune disorder, it could be epilepsy, cancer, it could be type 2 diabetes, a lot of that. Well, I direct them, one, a great website for type 2 diabetes, which is probably half of my emails are related to this, would be Virta Health. Virta Health have compiled all the clinical trials on their website for the use of ketogenic diet for type 2 diabetes and obesity too, I think. So I encourage, there's so much misinformation out there, and it gives the ketogenic diet a bad name because some people will point to certain studies. The ketogenic diet will be effective for some people, and it will be largely ineffective for a lot of other people. It also has side effects that people should be aware of. Like, there's potential lipid abnormalities. There's, if you don't have a gallbladder, it could be hard to follow. Females, younger females in particular, they could have amenorrhea, which it could disrupt their hormonal cycle. If you've had pancreatitis, liver disease, or any kind of genetic disorder that impairs fat oxidation or ketone production, and surprisingly, there's quite a few, and these are things that people may otherwise not know if they don't do a genetic test. Typically, if you follow ketogenic and you just don't feel well and you can't get ketones elevated, you probably have one of these SNPs, right? That just genetically you're not a good candidate for the ketogenic diet. So I think that's important too, to acknowledge that, it's a powerful metabolic therapy that has side effects, and there's a lot of misinformation around it, but the go-to source of information should be the primary research, which can be found on PubMed.
Got it. Dom D'Agostino, thank you so much for your time and for educating us. I'm going to end the recording, and then if you and I can wrap up for a couple minutes, that would be
Yeah, sure.
awesome.